This week on the agenda, Europe heads to the polls. But what's really at stake in the upcoming EU elections? And what might it all mean for the 27 bloc members? On June the 6th, the first polling stations will open in the Netherlands to begin one of the largest elections in the world. Nearly 400 million people across 27 countries will get the chance to decide who will sit in the 720 seats in the European Parliament. And with concerns over the conflict in Ukraine, the future of trade, the green transition and the rise of the far right, what might Europe look like after the vote? Joining me now are Jacques, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, Karel, Lannoo, Chief Executive of the Centre for European Policy Studies, Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of Politics at the University of Surrey, and Klaus, Jurgens, Director of Economy First. Thank you all for coming on the agenda. Jacques, let me start with you, because 2024 is the biggest ballot year in history, and the EU vote is the largest transnational election in the world. Why do you think that these elections matter perhaps more than European elections that have gone in the past?
They will matter in a way because they will reflect the evolution of political forces within Europe and within countries. But I don't think it will have much of an impact on the composition of the European Parliament. The interesting thing is that we'll see that the rise of populist parties, especially in the case of France, where the Rassemblement National, the list of Marine Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, is expected to top 30%. In France, this election is seen more, it's not so much about Europe, it's seen more as a preview of the presidential election of 2027. So at the same time, the European issues which have been highlighted by Emmanuel Macron are hardly discussed in the campaign. And that's why it's a very bad time for the government. We'll lose a lot of voices. We'll only have about 17%, while the Front National will be over 30%. So in that sense, it is interesting on a domestic point of view. But what is interesting is that the evolution within countries, you can see that within countries, populist movements have come into governments or are supporting governments. And we've seen recently an evolution in the policy making. We see that the agenda of the far right is beginning to influence economic policies in nations, and therefore also will influence the evolution of policies, especially regarding immigration, for example, in the European Union.
Karel, would you agree with that assessment?
I would take it a bit more from an international perspective, meaning the evolutions or the way in which voters will react in member states may be fairly different, and there may be a focus on some countries at the moment, but not sufficiently on others, meaning how Germany will vote or how Poland will vote will be probably totally different than how the Netherlands or how France will vote. Or also we see the UK, who's no longer a member of the EU, will be voting most likely totally differently when they vote, say, in October or November, for a Labour socialist government than what we will see in other European countries. So it's difficult to say what will be the general trend for these European elections. But let me say something on the participation rate, which already last time was one of the highest ever. In 2019, it was at 50%. By the way, at national elections, it's around to 70%. But for the European elections, it was one of the highest. Given what has happened over the last 5 years, we will be watching very carefully what this level of participation rate will be, and whether Europeans are really motivated to vote for what Europe stands for, as Europe is attacked in the war in Ukraine by Russia, as we had also the big COVID crisis, as we had also energy crisis, also instilled by Russia. So will Europeans react more European? Yes or no, that we'll have to see. And that remains to be seen, but it's very soon, and that's happening in 3 weeks.
Well, Amelia, we've been talking about some of those overwhelming issues that the bloc has been facing, from security with the conflict in Ukraine on its doorstep, to issues with the economy and with trade, and of course with immigration, issues over energy. Which of those do you think are going to have the biggest impact on voters?
Every one of them, to some extent, will have an impact. So you're right to sort of catalogue them like this. I think, in a sense, they all occur against the backdrop of a renewed far-right surge, if I could put it like that, and we can get into that in a bit more detail. But I think from a strategic perspective, the risk of the dwindling support for European support for Ukraine, and the sort of tacit and maybe even explicit dividing lines that are beginning to emerge with regards to just how much support is going to be needed. I think that's certainly going to be one of the key areas at the forefront in voters' minds. I think also the climate crisis. We've seen a lot of pushback getting stronger in the last couple of months. That's pushed for a more sort of watered down green European deal, if I call it that, and really tinkering with the content of the broader sustainability agenda in terms of issues like deforestation and agriculture, as well as ongoing issues with regards to energy security. Prices continue to be very high, very volatile, with no clear end in sight at this point, and that's because the perspective of where we're going with Ukraine itself is unclear. You mentioned migration. You're right to do so. I think this may be perhaps the ultimate in terms of bellwethers for the European elections yet to come. And I think we've got a bit of a paradox here. It's easily summoned up by far-right populist parties. It's very easy to get hyped up about immigration and, of course, the categories of migration, immigration, asylum seeking, etc. I think what we might see is that the more that happens, the harder it is to find active, sensible policy solutions to actually address that phenomena. And I think right-wing parties haven't clarified amongst themselves, and they'll have a harder time even in the parliament to be able to do that. So I think there's some very, very key issues that are going to be guiding voters as they come to that ballot box.
It's interesting what you say about the far right not being joined up with each other. I mean, Klaus, the polls, as we've been hearing, have been predicting a real surge towards support for nationalist parties and for the far right. You know, what are the implications if that happens? And is it all down to this overriding issue of migration?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and my esteemed colleagues already literally made fantastic points. Now, if I'm not wrong, there is the danger that combined the conservatives and reformists and the IDs actually could have more seats than any of either the left bloc or the EPP, respectively. Now, this would, of course, be a change of paradigm. I'm not saying into which direction. I will come back to the far right in a minute. I spent a lot of time, as you may know, in Austria and recently in Sweden, now basically in the United Kingdom. You do see, and this is, I think, still overlooked both by the European Parliament and by national mainstream parties. You see still a certain democracy deficit when the average, with all modesty, ordinary voter is asked about the European institutions and about the European Parliament in particular. It is still seen as something so far away. Does it really matter? Does it really impact us? And it is not the fault of the voters. It is still the fault of governments and European institutions not to bring those institutions closer to the people, to explain to them, we can actually do policies. We do have a viewpoint. We can impact your life positively. Let's go down to business. This would change a lot. And I would say it would take quite a bit of, the Germans would say, wind out of the sails of far-right populist movements who very cleverly, unfortunately, very cleverly, try to use this void by mainstream political parties to really explain Europe matters.
Well, a lot has changed, hasn't it, since the last European elections? I'm thinking in particular the huge economic downturn that's been experienced across the bloc. You know, Karel, what impact do you expect that to have on these election results?
For me, the most important indicator will be the participation rate, to say, do people really care about what the EU is doing? But I can agree with the previous speaker to say, look, it has been insufficiently explained what the EU is doing. However, I would say if you see how we have jointly reacted on the COVID crisis with joint purchase of vaccines, which I think if Europeans wanted to see it, they could see it, but also the energy crisis with a floor for energy prices, but also with what has happened in Ukraine with our sanctions against Russia, which was also jointly done. And if I can then look at one indicator, the current president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, is the person which is apparently best known of all the kind of European leaders ever. I don't speak about national political leaders, but of European political leaders. Her name recognition is one of the highest ever, which should indicate that Europeans know that there is something, an organization in the center which cares about them. Also, don't forget, Brexit has happened in the meantime, and we know for sure, let's say, how Britain is looking at the EU now. And if there is a change in government in Britain, which will happen in the coming months, they will certainly look to come closer to the EU again, away from what the Conservatives did.
Jacques, I wonder, is that how you see the economy affecting these election results too? I know you tend to zone in on France, but what's your take?
Yes, well, obviously the economy is having an impact, but I would like to make the point that actually the parliamentary elections are important, but the real power and the decision making, even though there's a principle of co-decision, the parliament has to vote the laws, it's the European Council, is the heads of government and state together, which impact on the evolution of the European Union. And we've seen actually, thanks to the European Council, there's been this response to the vaccine demand. We've seen that there's been the reflation package in order to boost the economies after the downturn. And at the moment, recently, the events which have been affecting people's view of Europe have been connected, as was said by some of the previous speakers, on the issues of energy. But recently, the big one is the issue of farming unrest, and the issues of and there, the European Parliament has a role of the trade deals, international relations, the trade deals with other countries, our attitude to and that's where the Parliament is very important. Some governments, Europe is very divided on the type of relation we should have, for example, with South America and also with China. And we see that the European Council decided to make an agreement on a trade deal with the Mercosur, but this has been up to now not ratified yet by countries and therefore by Parliament. So the economy is having an impact on the mood towards Europe in a way, but there's other factors, and the other one, the big one, in which European governments also have a big impact, is the issue of immigration. We've seen how Europe has toughened up its attitude towards migration, how Europe is, and that's decided by governments, how Europe is kind of paying countries to prevent migrants from coming from Africa into Europe. So this issue and the issue of identity, let's not forget the issue of identity, which is very prevalent, especially in the East and even here. There's a fight between two concepts of Europe, and we see this idea of that being European today means being kind of Christian and the type of culture which is which is coming from the influence of countries from the East and also from Italy and in other parts of the world. So the economy, yes, but also at the moment, one of the big concerns is immigration and identity.
Well, Amelia, attitudes to so many different issues, from the conflict in Ukraine to the economy, to what it means to be European. Those attitudes are so different across many different member countries. I wonder if you worry, if you're concerned that this election is going to widen those differences.
That's a tricky question, isn't it? Because you've got different levels going on. You've got obviously the sovereign states, the constituent parts of the European Union, and I absolutely take the point made by the previous speakers that there's a degree of public diplomacy that sometimes works and then sometimes doesn't. You've got the institutions themselves within Brussels, and you've got a whole body of law, the acquis, and then on top of that you have this sort of slightly ephemeral entity, a series of interlocking institutions, the union as a whole. And to try to say it has an identity is very, very tough. I know this, having studied it for long enough. It's a series of nested identities. I think we can go with that, and they're very, very hard fought and largely debated a lot of the time. I mean, as we teach our students, effectively, there's a number of types of Europe. On the one hand, the sort of island of peace, open, flexible, liberal, progressive, developing, and then on the other, one that has had to become far more, pragmatic and tough-nosed, and sort of woken up to the sort of geopolitical realities and the volatilities of the very neighborhood in which it finds itself, and to some degree has become much more straight-laced and much more of a fortress Europe perspective, if you like. So there are split personality disorders embedded within the European ideal to begin with, which makes for a slightly unhappy foundation. And then beyond that, of course, you have the whole host of national identities, which present different national interests, which present even more different foreign policies. At the same time, I think what we've seen is really quite stunning ability for institutionalization, socialization, compromise, and the ability, I think, to collaborate together and to cooperate together to produce a European method, a European way, a European instinct. And I absolutely agree with the point about name recognition. I think you can't really undermine that, and the elections are a really good example of that, of who and what Europe is. So brand Europe. Do you feel confident enough to be able to vote for your MEP because they know you and you know them, and they have a general idea of what their constituency wants and how to best represent it? Obviously, the idea of whether it's going to shift left or shift right tells you something else about the kind of identity preferences. But these, I think, are less important. These kind of come and go to some degree. And I think, given you have 720 seats, a lot of the time those peaks and troughs kind of come out of the wash, and you realign in terms of the voting anyway. So it's an ongoing project. Let's just put it like that.
An ongoing project indeed. Now, we'll pause there for a moment, but stay with us, as still to come here on the agenda, we'll hear what our guests think these elections might mean for relations with the United States and China.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to the agenda. Let's return now to our discussion of the issues that are set to have a very real impact on the upcoming EU elections. Still with me are Jacques, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute, Karel, Lannoo, Chief Executive of the Centre for European Policy Studies, Professor Amelia Hadfield, Dean International and Head of Politics at the University of Surrey, and Klaus Jurgens, Director of Economy First. The green transition would seem to be one of those big issues that's affecting the world. Klaus, I wonder how you think that is going to affect these elections, because traditionally Green parties have tended to do quite well.
Well, I think there's a huge chance if the mainstream parties, not only the Greens, actually take on kind of Stalinist policy-making doctrine. You have to go green, you have to go clean, because we tell you, no, you should do it. Zero waste, smart houses, passive houses, saving energy, different energy consumption modes and models. This is actually something which is literally right in front of your doorstep. And here the European, a transnational, Emily mentioned the split personality. I think this is a wonderful summary. There are so many angles and perspectives how this common house Europe could actually look like. Now let's forget about, do we want an ever closer union or not? Let's go down to business and issues. And I think issues is something politicians can convince their voters about tangible benefits. And the cleaner, greener society has absolutely tangible benefits. Second point, if I may very briefly, yes, indeed, farmers were mentioned. We can't get rid of our agricultural system. There is no more food. We have to take this debate away from climate activists, as perfect as they might be, unless they resort to violence, and we have to bring this into the mainstream. Now, who is better placed than a European Parliament, 720 different split personalities in a positive sense, who can agree on something instead of fighting 24 hours. Now, this would be a new approach to policymaking, and I fully agree. Energy, saving energy, how we approach the future of our planet, a clean planet, what can be done. It's not only about CO2, it is the way how we live. I just finished writing a paper about smart cities and sustainable development. It is still an academic debate, but if we bring it literally to the neighborhoods, the European Parliament would be well placed to, via its members of parliament, to achieve that.
You talk about getting down to business, and you could say that green energy, the green transition, pretty much goes hand in hand with trade. So let's talk a little bit about that. Karel, what impact do you think that these elections could potentially have on future trade relationships?
Difficult issue, because I think, as you said, that many of the European electorates may not know that the parliament has the final say on trade agreements. And if there is one thing I should say for this channel, is that parliament will certainly not for the foreseeable future agree with a trade agreement with China as the one which was proposed in 2000, China-Europe Investment Agreement, the CAI, because they can simply reject it. I think many Europeans will also know today that there is a huge problem with the import of electric cars, as we see also in the United States of China, and there is an investigation ongoing whether this is a matter of dumping or whether this is a matter of correct pricing, and there are many different views in Europe. So given that cars is a very important consumer good, I think many European consumers will know, and they will certainly have some position on the subject. We'll have to see this in 3 weeks.
Jacques, I wonder if you agree with that. I mean, with China alone, the EU has these ongoing probes that we've already been hearing about into electric vehicles, solar panels, train makers, wind turbines. I mean, do you think that there's a potential here for a new EU administration post-election that might change the strategy?
I don't think the administration as such will change, but these topics will remain, and they've been. For a long time, Europe pretended it was proud of the fact it was the most open market in the world. There was no borders, anyone could come in, etc. And there was no reciprocity. It was a bit naive. That was a certain view of Europe highlighted by Peter Mandelson, I seem to remember, who was Commissioner of Trade. Today is very different climate. Some countries are aware that Europe has been losing jobs, has been losing industries, and that is losing a lot of economic influence, and its economic prosperity is at stake. Europe is caught between the war between between China and the United States. You can see that if you take the two biggest economies in Europe, France and Germany, they have a very different rapport with trade on China. Germany depends a lot on the Chinese market, France less so. So who will win the day in terms of influencing the relations there? That's another matter. So the parliament will vote, and after that, don't forget that when like a trade agreement is passed, it also has to be ratified by national parliaments. Like we see, for example, the Mercosur trade agreement was voted by parliament, but has not been ratified by a country like France, for example, and some other countries. So it has not happened yet. So that's why I restate the fact that what matters more, it's not so much Parliament, is actually the position of the main governments, the main countries in Europe.
Amelia, Jacques put it out there. This is really about the EU's relationship with China, the EU's relationship with the United States. I mean, how do you think these elections might affect those ties, change the dynamics?
This is election year, obviously, as we know, with more than 2/3 of the world going to the polls. So that's, in a sense, something rather unusual. It means we're all watching each other's elections. So that's helpful, I think, particularly for scholarship. But I think it also means that, you know, the choices that are made are not done in isolation. And I think this year more than ever, we're watching very, very carefully, and I do say probably nervously as well, to the outcome of a number of elections. I think the degree of nerves is probably going to be at its height when we see what happens in the United States. I think there's very real concern, you know, among European policymakers, not least in the Commission and in the Parliament, in their new iteration post-election, as to what exactly is going to happen in the White House, because either way, it will have a profound impact on where the European Union as an identity, as a series of interlocking institutions, as a family, of nation states is going to go. Democratic support, I don't think it should simply be taken for granted. I think there will be very real demands, even from a democratic United States, with regards to where Europe sees its future, and specifically its relationship with the Ukraine. Republican administration, however, is going to really put the cat among the pigeons. There will be searing questions about Europe's ability to secure and defend itself from a material perspective, the role and responsibilities it has towards the Ukraine, where it wants to go in terms of being a global leader and the transatlantic relationship as a whole. So, you know, without wishing to over-egg it, I think the stakes at this point, you know, could not be higher. So for that reason, we implore, you know, the voters to think very carefully when they go to the polls, and think about the responsible, reflective kind of European Parliament they need, because it's such an invaluable part of where Europe is as a governmental actor.
I want to pick up on something we mentioned earlier, and that was the UK leaving the European Union, because it's the first European election since that Brexit, and the concerns that other members might follow suit appear to have eased. But on the other hand, there are many countries lining up to join the bloc. I mean, Klaus, you are in Turkey right now, which has been on the waiting list for a couple of decades. So I just wondered how the outcome of the elections might affect enlargement discussions, and of course those broader questions around European identity. What do you think, Klaus?
Well, of course, now you've got me. I have to be careful. This is, of course, a comment I do make quite a bit, but very briefly, my personal viewpoint is enlargement is very positive. I remember growing up with the European communities, and then came enlargement. One in particular I want to mention, when Sweden and Austria joined, two countries that never had dreamt of joining, basically giving up huge chunks of sovereignty against funds, of course, and influence. But from this moment onwards, it was actually clear to me that enlargement is positive. It goes back to the Jacques Delors debate, deepening or widening, what should come first. And I've changed my mind. I always said deepening first of the internal market, make it workable, then we can enlarge. Ultimately, it was right to enlarge first and then hopefully make it workable one day. This is multiculturalism, transnationalism, internationalism by definition. So yes, I'm in favor of enlargement. It has to come in steps and doses, but singling out one country not to join after so many decades, I think this was always a big mistake, and I hope the new European Parliament might actually come to a point to suggest to the Council we should speed up accession negotiations with Turkey as well. The bloc would benefit greatly. It is no longer about would a candidate country benefit. The bloc would benefit greatly too.
Klaus, Jurgens, Amelia, Hadfield, Jacques, Reland and Karel, Lannoo, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, preparing for Paris, we speak exclusively to the President of the International Olympic Committee, Thomas Bach. But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.